There are moments in war when the bombs matter less than a single word. No. No ceasefire. No pause. No symbolic handshake to calm the cameras. No diplomatic off-ramp dressed up as prudence. In the middle of escalating strikes, rising oil, and a region already trembling under the weight of miscalculation, Tehran's message has been brutally simple. There is no room to discuss a truce while attacks continue. That is not just a rejection of a proposal. It is a declaration that this war has entered a darker phase. Because once a government decides that stopping the fighting looks more dangerous than continuing it, the conflict changes shape. It stops being only about targets hit, missiles intercepted, or facilities destroyed. It becomes a test of political survival, regime credibility, strategic pain tolerance, and national humiliation. And those are the kinds of wars that do not end cleanly. They drag. They metastasize. They spill beyond the battlefield and into shipping lanes, fuel prices, alliance politics, election year calculations, and the daily lives of people who may be thousands of miles from the explosions. That is why this story matters so much. On the surface, it sounds like a familiar line from a familiar crisis. One side is under attack. It says it will not negotiate under fire. We have heard versions of that before. But this time, the timing is everything. Iran is not rejecting a ceasefire from a position of calm. It is doing so in the middle of a war that has already begun to reshape the wider region, shake energy markets, and raise the possibility that what was sold as controlled escalation may be turning into something far messier and far more expensive. And the official story coming from the other side has always rested on a very clear assumption. Maximum pressure would work. Hit hard enough, hit fast enough, break command structures, raise the cost, show dominance, and eventually, Tehran would have to choose between pain and retreat. The theory behind that logic is old. Shock the adversary. Demonstrate overwhelming force. Create enough internal stress that diplomacy becomes less a choice than a necessity. Force a ceasefire from a position of weakness. But what happens when the target does not respond the way planners expected? What happens when pressure does not produce de-escalation, but instead hardens refusal? What happens when the demand for a ceasefire begins to look, in the eyes of the state being hit, less like peace and more like surrender with better branding? That is the contradiction now sitting at the heart of this war. Iran's public line has been that it did not start this war and will not discuss halting it while American and Israeli attacks continue. That position has been echoed through official channels and reinforced by the atmosphere around Iran's leadership at a moment of extraordinary pressure. At the same time, reported remarks in the name of the country's new supreme leader have projected not caution, but defiance. Keep fighting. Keep retaliating. Keep raising the cost. The message is not subtle. Tehran appears to be signaling that it would rather absorb immense damage than accept a ceasefire on terms that make it look broken. Reports from the past few days describe exactly that harder posture, including the insistence that negotiations cannot happen under active bombardment, and public vows to continue the fight. That matters because wars are never fought only in military space. They are fought in political time, and political time is unforgiving. A leadership under attack can sometimes compromise, but a leadership under attack, under succession pressure, under symbolic pressure, and under the gaze of its own security establishment, often sees compromise very differently. It sees optics. It sees weakness. It sees precedent. It sees the nightmare scenario where enemies conclude that enough force can always produce capitulation. So even if a ceasefire would save lives, stabilize markets, and reduce the risk of regional disaster, agreeing to one too early may carry its own existential cost for a regime built on resistance. That does not make the choice rational in a humanitarian sense. It makes it understandable in a power sense. And power, in moments like this, is usually the more decisive language. This is where the war becomes more dangerous than many headlines admit. Because once the logic shifts from battlefield calculation to legitimacy calculation, incentives start pointing in the wrong direction. Every strike can make negotiation harder. Every threat can raise the domestic price of restraint. Every public demand for surrender disguised as peace can strengthen those inside the system arguing that only escalation preserves dignity. And once those voices gain ground, the space for diplomacy shrinks dramatically. Now add the second layer, leadership and image. Transitions at the top of a system like Iran's are never merely administrative. They are tests of authority. A new leader stepping into power during war does not inherit calm. He inherits scrutiny. He inherits rivals, doubters, internal factions, armed institutions, and an external enemy watching closely for hesitation. In that environment, restraint can look like drift. Ambiguity can look like weakness. A softer line can invite suspicion. From the very hardline forces a new ruler needs to keep aligned. That does not prove that every decision now is being driven by personal legitimacy, but it strongly suggests that the domestic politics of power transfer are making a ceasefire harder, not easier. The refusal to stop may be about strategy. It may be about retaliation. It may be about bargaining position. But it also appears to be about proving that the state has not been psychologically broken. And if that reading is even partly true, the implications are severe. Because it means the war is not approaching an off-ramp. It is approaching a lock-in. Meanwhile, outside the official statements, the market has already started rendering its own verdict. Oil has jumped back above $100 a barrel, as fears grow over the security of the Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which a massive share of global energy flows. Reporting in the last day describes tanker traffic disruptions, widening concern over energy security, and a broad sense that the war is no longer a contained military confrontation. It is becoming a systemic shock, with material consequences far beyond the region. This is where the deeper blowback begins. Because a rejected ceasefire is not just a diplomatic setback. It is a market signal. It tells insurers that the risk window is staying open. It tells tanker operators that delay may be safer than transit. It tells importers and governments that contingency plans may soon become operational necessities. It tells traders that the premium on disorder is real. It tells central banks that inflationary pressure may not stay buried. And it tells ordinary people, often before they even understand the battlefield map, that something far away is about to become very local. The modern world is built on fragile assumptions of movement. Tankers keep moving, fuel keeps flowing. Shipping schedules remain annoying but broadly reliable. Food, plastics, fertilizers, aviation, trucking, power generation, logistics. All of it depends on systems that work best when geopolitics stays in the background. But when a war reaches for a maritime choke point, geopolitics moves to the center of the machine. And that is what makes this moment so combustible. Iran does not need to win a traditional military victory to create enormous strategic pain. It only needs to make the costs of continuation high enough, long enough, and unpredictable enough that the entire coalition aligned against it starts arguing with itself. That is the real chessboard here. Not just missiles for missiles, but pressure for fracture. Can Washington sustain a high-intensity campaign if the result is a prolonged energy shock, jittery markets, stretched force protection, and growing political discomfort at home? Can Israel keep escalating if the broader region becomes harder to manage and the economic consequences intensify? Can Gulf states continue balancing between security cooperation and domestic vulnerability if the war threatens their infrastructure, their trade, and their own stability? Those questions get sharper, not softer, when a ceasefire is rejected. And notice something else. The more this war expands into economic space, the less control any single actor really has over the consequences. Military planners can calculate strike packages. Governments can craft talking points. But markets have their own psychology. And once fear spreads through shipping, energy, and insurance, the impact starts compounding. That is how regional wars become global inflation stories. That is how limited operations end up bleeding into growth forecasts, freight costs, airline margins, food prices, and consumer anxiety. This is why the official narrative of controlled pressure deserves skepticism. Pressure can work, but pressure can also overshoot. It can create not submission, but a hardening of identity and a wider field of retaliation. It can transform a state's military weakness into a kind of asymmetric leverage over the global economy. And that appears to be the danger emerging now. Tehran may be battered. It may be under extraordinary strain. But by refusing a ceasefire under fire, it is sending the message that it still has ways to make everyone else pay. And for ordinary people, that may be the most important part of the story. Because the first victims of wars are not always the first people to feel the costs. A family in Europe may see it at the gas pump before it understands the name of the official who rejected the truce. A small business in Asia may feel it in transport costs before it can locate Hormuz on a map. Farmers, truckers, factory owners, airlines, consumers, investors, none of them need to care about the ideological language of the conflict to suffer from its consequences. In a tightly wired world, a war that keeps going is not just a regional tragedy. It is a tax on distance, on energy, on stability, and eventually on political patience. And that last point matters enormously. Democracies under economic pressure become harder to govern. Coalitions under strategic pressure become harder to hold together. Populations that tolerate distant wars in abstract moral language become less tolerant when those wars begin to show up in rent, fuel, food, and jobs. That is how military campaigns lose clarity. Not always because they fail militarily, but because the costs become too widely distributed and too politically awkward to ignore. So where does this go from here? One path is that the current rejection is tactical, not final. In that version, Tehran says no now because saying yes now would look humiliating. It absorbs, retaliates, signals hardness, and waits for a formula that allows a pause without the appearance of capitulation. That could mean indirect mediation, face-saving language, reciprocal de-escalation, or a quiet sequence in which all sides reduce activity without publicly admitting concession. It would not be a peace deal in the grand sense. It would be something colder and narrower, a mutually useful ambiguity. That path is still possible, because even the most rigid wartime rhetoric sometimes masks a search for better terms. But there is a second path, and it is much darker. In that version, the rejection of a ceasefire is not a bargaining tactic. It is the opening signal of a longer war of attrition in which none of the major actors can easily step back without appearing defeated. The United States and Israel intensify pressure to prove refusal carries unbearable costs. Iran responds by widening the field of pain. Energy, maritime risk, regional allies, perhaps cyber operations, perhaps attacks calibrated to avoid total war while still deepening instability. The Gulf becomes more exposed. The market stays volatile. Insurance and shipping distortions harden. Humanitarian strain widens. Diplomatic language continues, but only as a thin layer over an increasingly normalized state of confrontation. That is the path where the war stops being an event and becomes an environment. And history is not kind to wars that become environments. They deform the politics around them. They empower hardliners. They reward maximalists. They punish nuance. They create sunk costs and emotional momentum. They teach leaders that backing down is riskier than pressing on. By the time the world starts urgently demanding an off-ramp, the internal political logic inside the main capitals may already be moving in the opposite direction. Which is why the rejection of a ceasefire should not be treated as just another line in a diplomatic cycle. It may be the moment when the central truth of this war becomes impossible to ignore. No one involved seems able to stop without paying a price they currently view as intolerable. That is what makes this so dangerous. Not simply the firepower, not simply the rhetoric, not simply the dead, the displaced, or the markets, though all of those are grave enough. The deeper danger is the collision between military escalation and political immobility. Everyone says they want stability. Everyone says they want deterrence. Everyone says they want security. But the incentives on the ground may now be pushing every major actor toward exactly the opposite. And if that is true, then the ceasefire that was rejected this week was more than a missed diplomatic opening. It was a warning. A warning that this war may no longer be governed by the logic outsiders prefer. A warning that pressure is not producing the neat outcome its advocates promised. A warning that the battlefield and the market are beginning to merge. A warning that what looks like regional conflict can become global blowback with terrifying speed. The question now is not just whether a ceasefire can be revived. The question is whether there is still enough political space left for any side to accept one before the war rewrites the region around them. Because if stopping looks like surrender, then escalation starts to look like survival. And that is when wars become hardest to end. So ask yourself 3 things. If Tehran believes a ceasefire under fire would amount to public submission, what exactly could bring it to the table without first changing the military reality? If the strategy of overwhelming pressure was supposed to force de-escalation, what does it mean that the visible result, at least for now, is more defiance, more market panic, and a wider sense of danger? And if this keeps going, if the strikes continue, if the truce remains rejected, if the oil shock deepens, if the region edges further into long war, who will ultimately pay the heaviest price? The leaders issuing the threats, the systems built on resistance, or the millions of ordinary people who never chose any of this in the first place?